First-generation warfare, or 1GW as it's sometimes called, is really the classic old-school way of fighting a war, the kind you might picture from history books or epic films. Think of it as a contest between nations, where proper armies representing their states clash on clearly marked-out battlefields. There are usually identifiable soldiers wearing uniforms and belonging to specific units, who are sent into combat with the primary aim of physically defeating the enemy's forces. The objectives are pretty straightforward: capture territory, destroy the opponent's ability to fight, or force their government to surrender. It's warfare where the lines, both literally on maps and figuratively between combatants and civilians, were meant to be reasonably clear, at least in theory. The main features of this type of conflict are quite distinct. You have large groups of soldiers, often organized into regiments and divisions, who would maneuver and fight in formations. These soldiers would typically wear the colors of their nation, making them easily identifiable on the battlefield, distinguishing friend from foe. The weapons used were what we now call conventional: rifles, cannons, bayonets, and later on, machine guns, tanks, and basic aircraft. The battlefields themselves were specific physical locations: fields, forests, or even heavily fortified trench systems, where the bulk of the fighting was concentrated. There was a sense that war, while brutal, had a certain set of understood, if not always followed, rules of engagement, a sort of grim choreography to the chaos. This form of warfare really solidified after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which established the idea of sovereign states. With states came state armies, and war became an extension of state policy, a tool used by governments to achieve their aims. The focus was very much on direct confrontation, on bringing your army to bear against the enemy's army in open battle. Victory was often measured in terms of ground gained, enemy casualties inflicted, or fortresses captured. It was a kind of war that required immense national effort, mobilizing not just soldiers, but also resources and industry to support the men at the front lines, fighting for king, country, or a particular political cause. Unlike the more shadowy, complex conflicts we hear about today, first-generation war had a certain, albeit grim, clarity. There was a formal declaration of war, a clear start, and often a formal peace treaty to mark its end. The distinction between wartime and peacetime was much sharper. The enemy was, by and large, another uniformed soldier from a rival nation-state. While civilians undoubtedly suffered, the primary targets were military forces and their infrastructure. This direct, state-on-state confrontation, fought with massed armies for tangible objectives like land, is the bedrock understanding of what traditional warfare has been for centuries, shaping nations and the course of history through raw physical power. If we cast our minds back, the Napoleonic Wars, which raged across Europe in the early 19th century, serve as a quintessential example of first-generation warfare. Picture vast armies, tens of thousands strong, maneuvering across the countryside like giant chess pieces. Infantry soldiers, packed into dense columns or drawn out in long lines, would advance under a hail of cannon fire. The cavalry, with sabers flashing, would scout, screen, and charge at opportune moments, trying to break enemy formations. Artillery batteries would pound enemy positions, softening them up before the infantry assault. Leaders like Napoleon Bonaparte mastered this art of massed manpower and linear tactics, seeking decisive battles that could shatter an enemy's army and will to fight. Then, fast forward about a century, and we arrive at World War I, a conflict that, while introducing horrific new technologies like machine guns, poison gas, and tanks, still bore many hallmarks of first-generation warfare, especially in its early stages and underlying philosophy. Millions of men were mobilized into vast national armies, deployed along clearly defined fronts that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. The infamous trench warfare that developed on the Western Front, with its static lines, barbed wire, and over-the-top assaults, was a brutal evolution of older siege tactics, but still fundamentally about uniformed armies fighting for territorial control in identifiable locations. The scale was unprecedented, the slaughter immense, but the core idea of defeating the enemy army remained. The American Civil War, fought in the mid-1800s, also fits squarely into this mold of first-generation conflict. Two distinct sides, the Union and the Confederacy, raised large armies that fought across recognizable battlefields like Gettysburg and Antietam. Generals employed tactics that wouldn't have been entirely alien to Napoleon, relying on infantry assaults, artillery bombardments, and cavalry actions. While industrialization was beginning to change the face of war, with railways for troop transport and ironclad warships, the fundamental nature of the fighting, state-controlled armies clashing directly for political and territorial objectives, was very much in the first-generation style. It was a war fought with massed formations and a heavy reliance on the courage and discipline of the common soldier. These historical examples highlight the key characteristics: the use of massed manpower, the importance of discipline and formation, and the objective of physically overwhelming the enemy on a designated battlefield. Success often depended on logistics, the ability to supply these massive armies, and the strategic acumen of generals in maneuvering their forces. The battles were often bloody, attritional affairs, where victory was hard-won and came at a terrible human cost. Yet, this was the accepted, even romanticized form of warfare for a very long period, shaping the military doctrines and national identities of many countries around the globe, leaving an indelible mark on our collective memory of armed conflict. Now, you might think that in our age of cyber attacks, information warfare, and shadowy non-state actors, this old-fashioned way of fighting is a relic of the past. And it's true, warfare has evolved, giving us what some call fifth-generation warfare, which is far less about physical battlefields and much more about influencing minds, disrupting systems, and using tools like disinformation or economic sabotage. In these newer forms, the lines between war and peace, combatant and civilian, can become incredibly blurred, and the enemy might not even wear a uniform or belong to a recognizable state army. It's a much more diffuse and often invisible kind of conflict, a far cry from lines of soldiers facing each other across a field. The crucial difference with first-generation war lies in its very physicality and visibility. In 1GW, you needed soldiers physically present to take and hold ground. The enemy was tangible, visible, and the objectives were generally about controlling territory or dismantling the opponent's military machine. There was a clear geographical focus, and the means of war, however brutal, were direct and overt. This contrasts sharply with, say, a cyber attack that cripples infrastructure from thousands of miles away, launched by an anonymous group. The older form of war required large, expensive armies and significant national resources, which generally limited widespread participation primarily to established states, rather than smaller groups or individuals. Yet astonishingly, elements of first-generation warfare persist stubbornly, even in the 21st century. Look no further than the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Since the full-scale Russian invasion in February 2022, we've seen scenes that could be ripped from the grimmest pages of World War I history books. We're talking about extensive trench systems, artillery duels that pulverize landscapes, and soldiers engaged in incredibly difficult, slow-moving battles for every town and village. The fighting has involved large formations, conventional weapons like tanks, artillery, and infantry assaults, all aimed at capturing or defending physical territory. It's a stark reminder that taking and holding ground often still requires boots on the ground. Despite the widespread use of advanced modern technologies like sophisticated drones for reconnaissance and attack, or precision-guided missiles, the fundamental nature of much of the fighting in Ukraine echoes these older methods. We see clear front lines, albeit ones that can shift, and identifiable state armies clashing in direct combat. Tank columns, vital supply lines, and the sheer mass of troops and materiel being deployed are all classic elements. It demonstrates that even with technological evolution, the core concept of using soldiers to seize and control territory for political ends, a defining feature of first-generation war, remains brutally relevant in contemporary conflicts, challenging any notion that this style of warfare has been entirely superseded. The human cost of first-generation warfare, especially when its brutal tactics resurface in modern conflicts, is always staggering. In Ukraine, for instance, the numbers are truly heartbreaking. By late 2023 and early 2024, reports indicated that tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers had been killed, with many more wounded. Civilian casualties have also been devastating, with thousands, including children, losing their lives due to shelling, missile strikes, and the general chaos of war. Attacks on civilian infrastructure, like the destruction of a bus station in Cherkasy, highlight how even in conflicts with clear front lines, the impact ripples far beyond the immediate combat zone, shattering ordinary lives and communities. The societal impact of this kind of warfare is profound and long-lasting. Entire populations can be displaced, becoming refugees in their own country or abroad. In Ukraine, the nightly reality of air raids, sirens, and bombings in many regions has inflicted widespread psychological distress, creating a trauma that will likely echo for generations. We see ordinary citizens, people who never expected to be soldiers, taking up arms, with large parts of the Ukrainian army composed of volunteers. Families are torn apart, with loved ones at the front, missing or lost forever. This mass mobilization and societal disruption are hallmarks of the immense strain that large-scale conventional war places on a nation. The scars left by such conflicts are not just physical, etched into landscapes and bodies, but also deeply psychological and societal. Think of the stories from World War II, where people associated the sound of storms with bomber jets years later. That's generational trauma. The current war in Ukraine is undoubtedly creating similar deep-seated anxieties and memories. Beyond the immediate human suffering, there's the destruction of infrastructure, airports closed, supply chains broken, economies crippled. And while resilience and a powerful spirit of volunteerism often emerge, the spectre of war fatigue, both within the affected nation and among international supporters, becomes a very real challenge to sustaining the fight and eventually rebuilding. Understanding first-generation warfare, therefore, remains crucially important today, not just as a historical exercise, but because its brutal realities haven't vanished. It's vital because these methods of direct state-on-state territorial conflict are still being employed, often alongside newer, more technologically advanced forms of warfare. Recognizing the patterns, the immense human cost, and the societal devastation inherent in this type of conflict helps us to understand current events, to appreciate the enduring drive for security and resources that can fuel such wars, and ultimately to underscore the desperate need for peaceful resolutions and the prevention of future conflicts of this devastating nature. The lessons of the trenches and the open battlefield are sadly still relevant.